In 1720, a 5-year-old boy in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was worth exactly £6, not because anyone was selling him, because his father had pledged him as security on a debt. The child's labor from age 5 until age 21 was written into a contract and handed to a creditor the way you might hand over the deed to a barn. If the father failed to pay, the creditor kept the boy, not as a slave in the legal terminology of the time, but as a bound servant, a child whose body and years belonged to someone else because his father needed £12 to survive the winter. That boy was not unusual. He was the system. Before America had banks, before it had paper currency that held its value, before it had any reliable institution where a struggling family could borrow money and pay it back on terms, it had children. And children could be converted into something the economy understood: labor measured in years. The mechanism was called indentured servitude, and when we hear that phrase, we think of European immigrants who traded 7 years of work for passage across the Atlantic, adults making a calculated choice. But the records tell a different story. A significant and largely unexamined percentage of indentured servants in colonial America were children, not teenagers, children, some as young as 3 and 4 years old. The Virginia Company records from 1619 onward document the shipment of children from London parishes to the Jamestown colony. In 1619, the City of London authorized the transportation of 100 children, described as vagrant and destitute, to Virginia. The children were collected from Bridewell and Christ's Hospital. When some of the older children resisted, the Privy Council issued a special order in January 1620, granting authority to compel them. That word should stop you. Compel. The government of England issued a legal instrument specifically to force children onto ships bound for a colony where the mortality rate exceeded 50%. These children arrived in Virginia and were immediately bound out. Their indentures were sold to planters. A child of 8 might be bound until age 21. That is 13 years of labor purchased for the cost of a transatlantic passage. The planter who bought that indenture could sell it again. He could transfer it. He could bequeath it in his will. The child moved with the contract like equipment attached to a property. And here is what nobody talks about. This was not an emergency measure that faded once the colony stabilized. It became the foundation of colonial labor economics, and it expanded. By the mid-1600s, every colony in British North America had laws governing the binding out of children. Massachusetts passed its Poor Law in 1659, requiring selectmen to bind out the children of any family deemed unable to maintain them.
Virginia had similar statutes. Pennsylvania, under William Penn, codified the practice in the 1680s. These were not suggestions. They were legal mandates. Town officials had the authority to enter a household, determine that a family was too poor, and remove the children. The parents had no right of appeal in most jurisdictions. The children had no representation whatsoever. The bound child became an economic unit, and like any economic unit, it could be leveraged. Colonial court records from Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania contain cases where children's indentures were used as collateral in debt transactions. A farmer who owed money to a merchant could pledge the remaining years on a child's indenture as partial security. If the debt went unpaid, the creditor assumed control of the child's labor. The child had no say. The child often did not even know the transaction had occurred until a stranger arrived to collect them. I want to be precise about the scale. In 1755, Benjamin Franklin estimated that Pennsylvania alone had approximately 6,000 indentured servants at any given time. Other estimates from the period suggest that between 1/2 and 2/3 of all white immigrants to the colonies south of New England arrived under some form of indenture. Among those bound servants, children represented a substantial portion. The Philadelphia almshouse records from the 1760s through the 1790s show hundreds of children bound out by overseers of the poor. The ages recorded start at 2 and 3 years old. 2 years old. bound by a legal contract to labor for a stranger for the next 19 years of their life. Now, the official narrative frames this as charitable. The argument goes like this: these children would have starved. Their parents could not feed them. Binding them to a master guaranteed food, shelter, and the promise of training in a useful trade. Some indentures even stipulated that the child must be taught to read and write, and in some cases the system did function that way. I do not deny that. Some children were placed with families who treated them well and taught them skills that served them for life, but the economics tell a different story. A child bound at age 5 until age 21 represented 16 years of labor. At prevailing rates, a bound servant's annual labor value in the mid-1700s was estimated between £8 and £15. 16 years of a child's labor was worth between £128 and £240. The cost of feeding and clothing that child over the same period was a fraction of that value. The math made children profitable, and anything profitable in a colonial economy without banking infrastructure becomes currency. The absence of banks is the key to understanding why children occupied this role. The first commercial bank in the United States was the Bank of North America, chartered in 1781. Before that date, and in practical terms for decades after in rural areas, there was no institution where an ordinary person could deposit savings, borrow against future income, or access credit. The economy ran on barter, promissory notes, personal credit, and trust. And the most reliable store of value a poor family possessed was not land, not livestock. It was the future labor of their children. A cow might die, a crop might fail, but a healthy 7-year-old represented 14 years of guaranteed productive work. Creditors understood this. Courts enforced it. The records of the Boston Overseers of the Poor from the 1750s through the 1820s document thousands of children bound out. Many entries note that the child was surrendered by a parent in exchange for the discharge of a debt to the town. The parent owed money for poor relief. The town accepted the child's indenture as payment. The child was the currency that settled the account. In the South, the practice intersected with something even darker. Orphan Courts operated in Virginia and Maryland specifically to manage the estates and indentures of parentless children. These courts were supposed to protect orphans' property rights. In practice, they became marketplaces. Guardians appointed by the court could bind out their wards and collect fees for the placement. A 1748 Virginia statute required guardians to post bond, ensuring they would not waste the orphan's estate. The very existence of that law tells you what was happening. Guardians were consuming the assets of the children they were supposed to protect so frequently that the legislature had to intervene. And even after the law passed, enforcement was sporadic. The guardian had the child. The child had no advocate. The court met once or twice a year. After the Revolution, the practice did not end. It evolved. The early republic faced the same problem the colonies had. Not enough banks, not enough currency, not enough institutional infrastructure to manage poverty, and so the same solution persisted. Between 1790 and 1850, American towns continued binding out poor children at enormous scale. New York's almshouse records from this period show children as young as 4 placed with masters. The Philadelphia House of Refuge, founded in 1826 as the nation's first juvenile reformatory, had the legal authority to bind children convicted of vagrancy until adulthood. Vagrancy. A child sleeping in the wrong doorway could be arrested and their labor sold for the next 15 years. By the 1830s, building and loan associations had begun appearing in working-class neighborhoods, offering families an alternative to destitution. The first in America, the Oxford Provident Building Association, was founded in Philadelphia in 1831. Mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations provided small emergency loans. These institutions slowly began to fill the gap that children's bodies had filled for 2 centuries. But slowly is the critical word. In rural areas and among the poorest urban populations, The binding out of children continued well into the 1870s and 1880s, merging seamlessly into the orphan train movement that shipped 250,000 children westward between 1854 and 1929. The through line is unbroken. A child in 1625 Virginia bound to a tobacco planter. A child in 1755 Pennsylvania pledged against a father's debt. A child in 1870 New York lined up at a train station while farming families inspected their teeth and squeezed their arms. The language changed. The legal framework shifted. The fundamental transaction remained the same. A child's future labor was the most liquid asset a poor family had, and the most exploitable asset a creditor could claim. What disturbs me most is not that this happened. Desperate people in desperate economies make desperate calculations. What disturbs me is the silence around it. We teach children about colonial America in every school in this country. We talk about Jamestown and Plymouth and the Constitutional Convention. We mention indentured servitude as a footnote, a transitional labor system that preceded and existed alongside slavery. But we almost never say that the servants were frequently children. We almost never say that a 5-year-old could be collateral. We almost never say that the system persisted not because people were cruel, but because the nation had no financial infrastructure and children's bodies filled the gap. The Bank of North America was chartered in 1781. The Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816. The national banking system was established in 1863. Each of these institutions made it slightly less necessary to convert children into economic instruments. Slightly. Because the practice did not end when banks appeared. It ended when compulsory education laws and child labor statutes made it illegal. And those laws did not reach every state until well into the 20th century. Mississippi did not pass a compulsory school attendance law until 1918. The Fair Labor Standards Act, restricting child labor at the federal level, was not enacted until 1938. That means for the first 330 years of European settlement on this continent, children functioned as a form of living collateral, not metaphorically, contractually. Their years were counted, their labor was priced, their bodies were pledged and transferred and inherited. And when we look at our family trees and find an ancestor who simply appears in a record with no parents listed, no origin noted, just a name and a master and a date, we are probably looking at one of them. The banks came eventually. The laws came eventually. But the children who passed through that system before the laws arrived left almost nothing behind. No memoirs, no testimony, no record of what it felt like to be 5 years old and learn that your father's debt now belonged to a stranger, and that you were how he planned to pay it.